Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. In Afghanistan, despite the Doha peace deal between the Taliban and the US, violence has increased in the country, resulting in a surge in civilian casualties. Taliban say they are committed to the deal and other parties must fulfill their end of the obligations. Now, the US is supposed to withdraw its troops completely by the next year from Afghanistan under the Doha peace deal. As the US heads towards the presidential election this year, it seems that President Trump's administration is trying hard to win the trust of the American public by engaging relentlessly in Afghanistan to resolve all the outstanding issues. Now, COVID-19 pandemic has also added to the urgency of the withdrawal, with some reports suggesting that the drawdown is happening faster than required. But on the other hand, sporadic explosive episodes between the US and Iran tell a different story altogether. The US has targeted Iran with sanctions and even threats to hit naval vessels in the Persian Gulf. Iran has also responded strongly and aggressively to the policy of maximum pressure. The relations between the two countries deteriorated, particularly after the US unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and later on assassinating the top Iranian commander, General Qasem Soleimani. Now, clearly, the US has two different policies toward the two different countries of the same region, which are in fact the neighbors. To understand this, we are joined today at Newswire by Mr. Vakkas Dogantekin, who is Chief Correspondent for America Desk in Anadolu News Agency, joining us from Ankara, and Mr. Pardes, who is a journalist who is joining us from Kabul. Thank you for your time, both of you gentlemen at Newswire. We really appreciate that. I'll start the discussion with you, Mr. Dogantekin. Clearly, two different policies. US on one side is engaging relentlessly with the Afghan Taliban to end the 19-year-old war. On the other side, we see its aggressive posturing towards Iran. What kind of duality in its policy is towards these countries?
So when we look at the US policy towards Afghanistan, we see, of course, major radical changes since Trump took over in 2016. And in 2017, August, he made a speech on Afghanistan. He said, we have now a revised strategy and we want a political settlement. And then they wanted to build on that decision of Trump to do something major about Afghanistan. And they have a goal, they have a plan in mind. They know what they want to do. I mean, I'm talking about the Trump administration. But honestly, I think they don't know how to do it. They have taken out Afghan government out of the picture when they started direct negotiations with the Taliban, because the long-standing US policy was always an Afghan-led and Afghan-initiated peace process with the Taliban. But Trump administration went a different course and said, okay, no need for the Afghan government, and we will just directly deal with the Taliban. And then they appointed Zalmay Khalilzad in 2018, September, I think. And they wanted to expedite the process. But they only, I think what Trump administration has done is downplaying the importance of other regional powers and how Afghanistan actually got mired into these problems in 18, 19 years of US involvement in the country. What we see right now is since February 22, there is a reduction in violence agreement, so-called, revealed by the US officials. But I think what US administration wants to achieve by this reduction in violence in 14 months, they have a 14-month time frame to test how it goes with the Taliban. I think what they want to achieve is to see the real power of Taliban in the country. If they really have control over all armed groups across the country, if they are going to be able to stop those armed groups from, attacking Afghan forces. So if they see Taliban is promising a reduction in violence, and the violence continues despite the officials of Taliban, then they will think maybe Taliban is not the ultimate game maker in the country. There are other powers that are very important too. And the real process, I think, will start at the end of this month, at the end of this 14 months. So right now, I think the U.S. Intelligence agencies are testing the waters in Afghanistan. They are trying to see if there are other splinter groups that are independent of Taliban. They want to see how influential Pakistan is over these insurgent groups in Afghanistan, how important they are to Taliban. So within this 14 months, I think they will test the real power game in the country. And then they will be able to come up with a real strategy, a working strategy, because they are
Mr. Dogantekin, you basically alluded to the fact that it is actually the U.S. which is testing the strength and the capacity of the Taliban, whether it has the influence on different splinter groups in Afghanistan. We recently saw that the U.S. also admitted to having aided the Taliban in its fight against the ISIS Khorasan as well. So clearly a coordination between the U.S. and the Taliban going on in order to take the control of such type of splinter groups, as for example, the ISIS Khorasan is.
I mean, that issue is very interesting too. Like ISIS, what we call in this part of the country, Daesh, they are getting a ground in Afghanistan. And we know from the reports that India is also supporting these Daesh groups against the Taliban. And India has an extensive and major spy network in Afghanistan right now. And they have, they have even played an important role in the election council's announcement of Ghani in Kabul. Right before the victory was announced for Ghani, the Indian NSA, like Indian Intelligence Agency chief, Ajit Doval, was in Kabul for 1 day. So India has an important, effect on the Afghan policy. This is
Mr. Dogantekin, when you talk about India's increased role over there and its spy network in Afghanistan, don't you think it's detrimental for the overall Afghan peace process and the implementation of the Doha peace deal? Because when this particular deal was signed between the US and the Taliban, Pakistan clearly stated that there are certain powers which doesn't want this particular deal to come to fruition.
Of course. That's why I'm saying, this is not a deal you can just sign with Taliban and then suddenly peace will come to the country. There are other regional powers that have their own agenda in the country, and they have strong influence on the government. And of course, they don't like a situation, they don't like a scenario where the US administration is taking just one group as their counterpart, and they are trying to leave out the government, in this peace process. So I don't think it is an easy, I don't think there's an easy solution to this problem.
Mr. Dogantekin, you're of the view that it's an easy solution for the implementation of the Doha peace deal and the permanent political settlement in Afghanistan, because there are so many stakeholders involved in this particular whole process. With this particular point, I'll come to you, Mr. Pardes. Mr. Dogantekin just alluded to the fact that there is an increased role of Indian spy network over there in Afghanistan, and it is helping out ISIS Khorasan as well. That was the point which was alluded to by Pakistan when the Doha peace deal was signed between the US and the Taliban, that there are certain forces which wouldn't want this deal to be implemented and wouldn't like to have a permanent political solution in the country.
Thank you very much for having me. Up to some extent, I agree with Mr. Vakkas. But look, unfortunately, by passing every day, the violence and fighting has been intensifying in Afghanistan. And just in the recent week, we were witness of sharp increase in the civilian casualties and losing of innocent lives in Afghanistan. I think for now, the major setback towards the peace agreement between Taliban and US and also with the Afghan government is intensifying fight in Afghanistan and increasing of violation across Afghanistan. So for the time being, it seems that all parties who are engaged in Afghan war, they already launched their offensive, they already ram up their attacks. So it seems that at the time being, it doesn't looks that all sides which are engaged in Afghan fighting are ceasing their violence, and they are agreed to be, I mean, set an intra-Afghan negotiation table. But the special envoy of U.S. for Afghan peace and reconciliation, Zalmay Khalilzad, just returned from Doha, and he's trying to push the Taliban and also the newly reconciled Afghan leadership to sit together and put their grievances aside, and also sit together and also trying to push all sides to be, I mean,
Mr. Pardes, when you talk about the visits by U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, he has been relentlessly engaging with the Afghan authorities and the Taliban. He has been coming back and forth to Afghanistan and Doha and also Pakistan. Why do you think the U.S. is so much relentlessly engaging in Afghanistan in order to come overcome all the outstanding issues within this country? Is it because of this particular year, which is the presidential election year, for President Trump to have won back the trust of the American public as well?
I think both. The election in the United States and as well as the public pressure on the U.S. or specifically or the Donald Trump administration. And the most important thing, the U.S. already signed a withdrawal deal with the Taliban. So it really, I mean, if the U.S. is trying to be kind of, success this deal, because it really engage, if the Taliban increase or continue their violence and the innocent people losing their lives, so it wouldn't be able to, I mean, we cannot call the deal would be successful. And also the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan is very much related to reduction in violence and also kind of set or starting intra-Afghan negotiation. So all the sides come together, and all the things, I think U.S. is trying to all the sides to be engaged in the intra-Afghan talks and also trying to success the peace deal which was signed in February.
So, Mr. Pardes, when you talk about the violence, a recent report by the United Assistance Mission in Afghanistan revealed the facts that there was increase or surge in violence from both the sides. It's not only the Taliban to be blamed. 25% of the violence which is attributed to Taliban. On the other side, we see there is 38% increase of the violence by Afghan National Security Forces. So clearly, the Taliban are not to be blamed alone. The violence is happening from the Afghan National Security Forces as well, which is much higher in percentage than that of the Taliban.
True, but the main thing, I mean, after signing peace deal, I cannot say peace deal, there's withdrawal deal of United States with Taliban. The Afghan people, they hope that the Taliban will reduce their violence, but vice versa, they increase and intensify the war in Afghanistan. So, and Afghan society also, I mean, on the answer of public pressure, the Afghan government or specifically President Ghani ordered its forces to launch offensive. So you were right. I mean, both sides, the Taliban, the Afghan security forces, and the most importantly, ISIS or Daesh, it is a deadly front in Afghanistan. So, I mean, the civilian casualties responsibility goes to each side. But for now, at the time being, if these sides, specifically I'm talking about the Afghan government and Taliban, if they want to start the negotiations, so the major setback for right now is the violence, and till the violence not decrease, so I think it wouldn't be possible they all sides come together and set a negotiation table.
Mr. Pardes, thank you for your time at Newswire. Journalist joined us from Kabul. We really appreciate that. And Mr. Dogantekin, I'll come to you. On one side, apparently, we see the relentless engagement by the U.S. in Afghanistan is aimed at ending the long 19-year long war and withdrawing its troops within the stipulated time as per the Doha peace deal. But on the other hand, towards Iran, it has continued its aggressive posturing. With the Afghan Taliban, it has gone into making a deal. Rather, on the other side, with Iran, it has gone into breaking the deal. That was signed between the Iranian government and the Obama administration. So why is there such a stark contradiction in the U.S. policy towards these two countries?
Regarding U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, what I would, conclude my saying, I think Afghanistan should not be a playground for the interests of major countries, U.S., India. Afghan people want peace. According to a recent survey, nearly 80% of Afghans, they want a peace process with Taliban, although maybe they don't support the group, but they want a peace process with the Taliban to bring, peace and stability to the country. So Afghans deserve peace, and they want just same standards as other world citizens. And I think all players in this game should respect the will of Afghan people and really do their best to end violence in the country, which I think, unfortunately, is not looking very good. Regarding Trump administration's policy towards Iran, it again is contradicting longstanding U.S. policies. The Obama administration before Trump was very much in harmony with Iran, and Iran actually developed a lot of potential in the region during that time because there were very limited sanctions, and they have increased their expansionist ideologies in the region, and they played a deadly role in Syria. And it was one of the countries that kept Bashar al-Assad, the criminal leader of Syria, alive and still surviving to this day. But when Trump came, he had a different agenda, and he aligned with mostly right-wing Jewish groups in the U.S. And they wanted a quick solution to Iranian problem, and they wanted to cripple Iran with economic sanctions. So it is right now an economic warfare against Iran. And
so, Mr. Dogantekin, you are of that it's basically the economic war which has been waged by the U.S. against Iran in particular. So, and now we are joined by Mr. Mostafa Khoshcheshm, who is an analyst joining us from Tehran. Thank you very much for your time at Newswire. We see two different policies by the U.S. administration under President Trump. On one side, it is relentlessly engaging with the Afghan Taliban in order to implement the Doha peace deal and trying to find a permanent political solution in the war-torn country. On the other side, we have seen in recent past, there have been sporadic explosive episodes between the two countries. The U.S. has targeted Iran with sanctions amid COVID-19 pandemic, and then there was the issue of the naval vessels, and there were threats by President Trump as well. Is the U.S. trying to shift its energies, efforts, and resources from Afghanistan to open up a new war front in Iran?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, as a matter of fact, I don't see that as any new effort. The United States administrations, no matter who we are talking about, we're talking about Obama, George W. Bush, or others, even Clinton and Donald Trump. They have long been pursuing a similar strategy of containment against Iran. They've been working on, various options. Before 2005, they came up with the idea that military action is no way, a solution or could prove successful. So they dealt with other possible measures and plans in order to contain at least Iran in various aspects of its, with regard to its power components in the nuclear industry in the region, as well as its missile industries and others. So this new strategy, the containment strategy, worked through imposing sanctions in order to encourage Iran to get into talks, and then through the talks we saw what happened. Then they contained, Iran's nuclear power for a short period. In the next step, they would go for Iran's missile industries as well as Iran's regional clout and the future of Iran's nuclear industries. This way, they hoped that they could contain Iran. Now, on this path, they would use the threat of military action, but not the military action per se, not the war, because they know the costs. But they would use, and they have been using, the threat of military action in various places like the Persian Gulf in order to change the equations in Tehran, to encourage them into talks. This maximum pressure policy, as a matter of fact, was started on the basis of a complete and detailed sanction structure and formula that was developed by President Obama. And he always bragged about his success in imposing the sanctions pressure in order to push Tehran to the talks. But because Donald Trump was, going for the similar strategy very naively without the advice of experts, and because Iran had experienced this through the nuclear talks and now knows the game and the rules of the game, now they failed to push Tehran to the talks. Now we could see that 2 years after imposition of the sanctions, that's set to be the maximum period that they could expect the efficiency of this maximum pressure policy to push Tehran to the talks. They have failed. Iranian people have been under pressure, but they've not taken to the streets to revolt against their government. Iran is now sending 5 tankers to Venezuela with their GPS systems on and not off. The same has happened with regard to 4 other Iranian tankers that are bound for China, according to Western media outlets, of course.
So, Mr. Khoshcheshm, when it comes to the difference between the policy under Obama administration, as you alluded to, that he also used to brag about the sanctions he was targeting Iran with, and later on, Trump had a sort of a naive policy towards Iran. That's why the policy of maximum pressure under Trump administration hasn't worked. But under Obama administration, Iran got the nuclear deal, much wanted and needed nuclear deal that Iran wanted for its nuclear program. So how do you differentiate that? I mean, this time around, Iran doesn't want to negotiate even with the Trump administration. But under Obama administration, what were the differences that Iran finally got that deal?
Well, first of all, from the Iranian side, the Iranians didn't have that experience. The Iranian people gave this agenda to President Rouhani, elected him to power in order to, they saw some dim hopes that talks could make a breakthrough, but now they have earned this experience that talks with the United States would never work, as was stressed by many Iranian experts under, when Obama was in office. But from the American side, President Obama knew for himself pretty well, and based on experts' views, sanctions are not the objective. They are the instrument in order to encourage Iran or any other targeted nation into talks. But for President Donald Trump, this formula is very loose. I mean, he's working on sanctions as if it's its main objective. On the other hand, Obama tried to encourage Iran that it would be a win-win game and not a zero-sum game. But what Donald Trump very openly is stating is that Iran needs to go for 12 preconditions before any talks could happen. This means that he is looking for a zero-sum game, a win-lose game. The United States is not credible in its offer. Let's remember that if it were a Clinton administration, a Biden administration, or Obama administration, they would go for the same strategy. Let's remember that the United States is a superpower. They do not shift their policies towards their arch foe like Iran or China every 4 years. They are pursuing long-term strategies, 20-year or 50-year-long strategies in order to pursue their goal. Now, if it were a Clinton administration, as Hillary Clinton even stated during the 2016 presidential campaign, she would also go for imposing tough sanctions on Iran in order to push Tehran to talks over its regional presence and especially its missile power. Now, Tehran is experienced now. Iran knows the rules of the game, and they know that if they go for talks, there is nothing in there for them. Let's remember that it was President Obama himself that started violating the nuclear deal. Let's remember that the visa waiver program was done under the Obama administration. Also, ISA, the Iran Sanctions Act, was extended under the Obama administration. And this shows pretty well because, I mean, that there is a reason for that. Obama knew, Clinton knew, also Trump knows pretty well that if they remove the sanctions, then this formula would never work because they need the pressure of the sanctions in order to push Tehran for talks over its other power components.
Okay,
so as
Mr.
long as
Khoshcheshm, when we talk, you just alluded to the fact that the Iranian people have never revolted against the government, but whenever President Trump talks about Iran and its people, he talks in two different terms. He wants the Iranian people to have freedom from the current regime, and he looks forward, well, actually relentlessly works this whole saga of its measures, sanctions, and threats, looks towards a regime change in Iran. But there had been reports of protests which happened in Iran as well, during which different international agencies quoted Iranian security forces opening fire on the common people. That's why the recent sanctions, as termed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have been imposed on Iran.
You know, there was a time when President Obama, you know, he had the face to claim that he is supporting the Iranian nation against the regime. He was trying to sow some seeds of discord between the nation and the state. But when it comes to President Donald Trump, everything is clear to the Iranian people. Even the opposition abroad that are fighting against the Islamic Republic, armed opposition even of the Islamic Republic, they have come to acknowledge that Donald Trump never cares about the Iranian people's rights or what the Iranian people would aspire. Look at the sanctions. Who are they pressuring through the sanctions? The Iranian people. They've been blocking the flow and the supply of medicine and food to Iran. These are the people that are feeling the burden of these sanctions and not the state.
People of Iran are actually feeling the burden of the sanctions being imposed by the U.S. relentlessly over the last many months in repetitive pattern. Mr. Dogantekin, how do you see the difference between the policy under Obama administration and the Trump administration, particularly towards Iran's nuclear deal?
I think what we have to understand is the domestic dynamics of U.S. Politics as well. You know, when Trump came to power, he aligned with, you know, maybe advised by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, he aligned with more hawkish Israeli groups, Jewish groups. And in the U.S., there are two major Israeli groups. One are very right-wing, very aggressive Zionist groups, and the other is a smart and patient and slow and steady kind of Zionist group. And the smart Zionist, the smart Jewish lobby in the U.S., they want the status quo in the region to continue against Iran. And they want the Obama kind of approach to Iran. They want to keep this enmity between U.S. and Iran, but they don't want to aggravate the situation. They don't want to take too many risks, because if things get out of control, then Israel is very much under threat by Iran and in the region from other groups. So these smart Jewish groups in the US, they hate Obama for his, they hate Trump for his reckless policies. I call them reckless because they call them reckless. But the right-wing Zionist groups, the right-wing Jewish groups that are actually better influencing Trump policies right now, they want complete dominance in the region. They want
the right-wing Zionists, as you alluded to, Dogantekin, or just want to take the hold of the entire policy and influence Donald Trump, and that might be at play at the moment regarding the policy towards Iran. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Vakkas Dogantekin, Chief Correspondent for America Desk in Anadolu News Agency, joined us from Ankara, and Mr. Mostafa Khoshcheshm, Analyst, joined us from Tehran. Thank you for your time at Newswire as well. And with this, we come to the end of the first part of the show. In the second segment, we will discuss free speech under fire in Bangladesh. For that, stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. In Bangladesh, free speech is under threat. In the past month alone, 60 cases against 100 people, including 22 journalists, have been registered under the controversial Digital Security Act. DSA is considered a draconian law by international human rights organizations and journalist bodies. This law is being used by the ruling Awami League, led by authoritarian Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, to suppress calls for the accountability for the misappropriation of the relief funds and mishandling of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, this trend is not new, as Sheikh Hasina's party's undemocratic practices during the general elections in 2018 were criticized by the world leaders, with the exception of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was quick to congratulate her on her victory through managed elections. The international media was not allowed the entry to cover the polls. Local journalists were harassed, intimidated, and attacked, while national broadcasters were shut down on the election day. And to talk more about this, we are joined at Newswire today by Mr. Mahboob Ali Khansur, who is executive editor at Asian Bangla, joining us from London, and Dr. David Lowe, security analyst and an expert in human rights, joining us from Liverpool. Thank you, both of you, gentlemen, for your time at Newswire. I'll start the discussion with you, Mr. Khansur. Why the freedom of speech in Bangladesh at this particular point in time, when the world grapples with COVID-19 pandemic, is under fire?
You know, a Bangladesh government can tolerate their criticism of against the news and against the main thing which is happened in Bangladesh. Bangladesh government cannot tolerate. That's why they made using the Digital Security Act against the people, against the journalists, against the blogger.
Okay, Mr. Khansur, it's not only the journalists which are coming under fire by the government authorities in Bangladesh. Many rights activists, as well as common people who are posting against the misappropriation of the funds, the relief funds, and mishandling of the COVID-19 crisis by the Bangladeshi government, are also being registered under DSA.
Yes. Not only against the government journalist, even who is the pro-government journalist, they also harassment. You know, yesterday, Sushant Das Gupta, editor of and publisher of daily Amar Hobbyganj, that means My Hobbyganj, arrested under the Digital Security Act from Hobbyganj, the district of Bangladesh. According to the case statement, Sushant Das published a news against a MP of Hobbyganj, and his name is MD Abu Jahil. Sushant Das Gupta published a news against the MP who misleading the relief.
Okay, it's just because of the fact that the misappropriation of the funds and the mishandling by certain MPs regarding COVID-19 pandemic is done. So people are being registered under this draconian law, which has been termed as draconian by not only the international human rights organizations, but also by the journalist bodies. Dr. Lowe, when we talk about the people being registered under this DSA, since 2018, since the election of 2018 in Bangladesh, at least 1,000 cases have been filed under this DSA. So what kind of state of affairs regarding freedom of speech and expression in Bangladesh happens to be?
I think it's a big concern because this is one of the first pieces of legislation the current Bangladeshi government introduced. We've had it now for about 18 months. And, you know, I sort of look at it, obviously one of my areas is looking at terrorism and security. And my initial feeling was, oh, this is a piece of legislation to deal with propaganda from terrorist organizations. And I know Bangladesh does have an issue with groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda, because we've seen the bombings in the past. And perhaps I've just taken a naive view here because it's quite concerning. The amount of arrests that have been certainly very recently. I think one problem is, and I do know from looking at the Bangladeshi law of evidence and procedure, it doesn't matter what offence it is, they have to be produced before the court within 48 hours of arrest. And of course, the courts are now currently shut because of the pandemic. And I know that there was one journalist whose name just escapes me for now, 53 days he wasn't seen. And this is a big concern because you need the freedom. Freedom of expression includes your freedom of the press, the fourth estate. The whole point of a responsible press, be it television, radio or print, is to hold governments to account and speak on behalf of the ordinary people. So this is quite concerning, and I think some pressure should be put on the Bangladeshi government.
So, Dr. Lowe, do you see any sort of correlation between what the draconian laws which are in place in the occupied Jammu and Kashmir in the form Public Safety Act and the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, under which, again, anybody who is registered under those acts, PSA in particular, he is detained without any charge or trial for at least 2 years. So is there any correlation between this DSA and there are journalists which are being registered in Indian-occupied Kashmir? So Bangladesh clearly following the footsteps of Indian policies as well.
Well, I sort of look at it in an objective way, and even as you introduced this item, Prime Minister Modi has congratulated the Bangladeshi electoral success. And again, that is another concern we've got, certainly with any reporting of southern Indian-occupied Kashmir. I was discussing this with you the other week. It is a big concern because India and Bangladesh are supposed to be democracies, and you look at the rankings of their press. It's 147 out of 180 states for India and 150 for Bangladesh out of 180. Now that's a big cause of concern. These are supposed to be democracies. In a democracy, you have opposition commentary. You have challenges to how you're behaving. You look at most states where this is operating, and it's sort of trying to not so much bringing governments to account, but make governments and certainly heads of state account for what their actions are and tell the people why they're doing things, taking certain actions. And I think there could be a correlation, certainly with what we're seeing in India, especially in relation to the South Kashmir, and with what we're seeing with the Digital Services Act in Bangladesh.
Okay. So, Dr. Lowe, when we talk about this particular DSA in particular, the National Press Club in Bangladesh said that this particular law should be actually used against the cyber security threats. Rather, it is being used against the journalists. So when the government or the authorities start using a certain law which was designed for some other purpose, and they are using it for some other purpose in order to achieve their vested interests, so who is actually going to hold such authorities accountable?
Well, yeah. This is. I mean, as I said just before. I mean, I looked at that piece of legislation, And I saw it for what we're talking about, dealing with organised criminals, or we're dealing with terrorist organisations who are posing a threat to your security. And now we're turning this act on those who are raising challenging points and now curbing freedom of expression. And I think the accountability, I think there's going to be an international pressure put on states like where we're looking at here with Bangladesh, from the UN and individual states themselves. I mean, the UK could play a role here. Bangladesh is part of the Commonwealth of Nations, and the UK could put pressure on the Bangladeshi government as well as others and say, look.
So, Dr. Lowe, you're of the view that it's international pressure which should be mounted on the authorities and the government in the countries like Bangladesh and India, so that the freedom of expression and freedom of speech, as per the international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, must be observed. Mr. Khansur, when we talk about the arrest of the people under this particular DSA, and they've been sent to jails, but the courts in Bangladesh are not functioning owing to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there happens to be a high risk of these people contracting the virus within jails.
Yes, I think government don't tolerate about the news, the everyday dying by coronavirus, but government want to hide how they have lack of management, management to control the coronavirus. So they want to control by media to hide the proper and accurate death in Bangladesh.
So, Mr. you're of the view that just for hiding its inability to tackle the COVID-19 crisis in the country and the misappropriation of funds and all the failures that the Bangladesh government had faced or done, it is trying to hide all those things by putting all these people under arrest. Thank you very much for your time at Newswire. Mr. Mahboob Ali Khansur, Executive Director, Asian Bangla, joined us from London, and Dr. David Lowe, Security Analyst and an expert in human rights, joined us from Liverpool. Thank you for your time at Newswire as well. This we come to the end of today's Newswire. We'll be back with you in the next episode. Till then, take good care.